Great to have you all here. And this is the Aquatic Habitat Canada webinar and learning dialogue on Indigenous partnerships in aquatic habitat management and restoration. So hello and welcome. I'm David Brown. I am the Director of Conservation at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. CWF is the host organization for Aquatic Habitat Canada, and we're very happy to help host today's learning dialogue. I wanted to acknowledge the work of Samantha Lau, who was the coordinator for AHC for Aquatic Habitat Canada and actually put this webinar together and worked with all of the speakers. And Sam has now moved on to work for Pollution Probe, and we wish her well in her new position and happy to just go ahead with the webinar and enjoy this learning dialogue. So I'm based in Ottawa. I want to begin right away by recognizing that I'm in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And more importantly, to say that the Algonquin peoples have stewarded this land and water since time immemorial and continue to be the protectors of this land. As a settler, I appreciate the stewardship, and I hope we can improve it over time because it hasn't been so great lately. In this virtual environment, land acknowledgements look a bit different as we're all located all across the country, not in one place. So I would encourage all the participants online. There is a chat button on your screen, and I see there's some posts in it already, to please take the time to go into the chat window if you'd like, introduce yourself and your organization, and recognize the traditional territories in which you find yourself tuning in today. So I'll give people a moment to just find that chat and see if people start. I see there's some posting going on. Okay, a little bit of background about Aquatic Habitat Canada. It was established by a multi-interest steering committee, and one of those steering committee members is going to be our host today, with the Canadian Wildlife Federation and strong support and involvement of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So Aquatic Habitat Canada is a national network focused on helping governments, local communities, Indigenous organizations, industry stakeholders, and conservation organizations more effectively protect and restore healthy and resilient aquatic ecosystems. AHC developed the Learning Dialogue series to engage the network in a greater understanding of issues related to aquatic habitat conservation. And this is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've done through AHC. So the email, you'll see the general email for Aquatic Habitat Canada is on the bottom left of your screen there, and you can stay updated with its activities through the website, which is also indicated there. So before we get right into it, there are, because we're in this Zoom platform that many of you know, but you may not have been into the webinar version of it, just a few housekeeping items about Zoom. So you will notice that your video camera and your microphone have been turned off for the duration of the presentations. You'll also notice that you should have had a notice that this session is being recorded, and a version of the webinar will be made available shortly after today, both on YouTube and on the aquatichabitat.ca website. There are a few functions I want to draw your attention to. One is the chat. The chat is for sharing and commenting during the webinar. You go down to the bottom there and click on the chat. Note that when you do that, you can choose who you are chatting with. So pay attention to that. And we encourage people to share with the whole group through the chat, and please select choose the button to address all panelists and attendees. That way the panelists can also see anything in the chat. That's not where we'd like you to post questions, though. That is in the Q&A. And that allows us to just moderate the questions better and to address them more effectively. So that's about the chat. After the presentations, there will be a chance for the audience, those of you out there listening in, to share experiences and perspectives after the presentations. And to do this, you'll use this raise hand function, and we will unmute and open up your video, and you can share for a minute or two a perspective or experience that is relevant to the conversation and gets people thinking. Finally, for questions for the panelists, please use this Q&A button. It'll open a little window. You post in your question, like what came first, the chicken or the egg in this example. And so you post them there. The panelists and the host, myself, will see that. Our chair will be able to go through those questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We may not be able to get to all the questions before this session ends, and apologize for that in advance. If you do find yourself disconnected from the Zoom platform because something drops, just log right back in with the same link that you used originally, and that should work for you. So today's session is, as I said, is the fourth of the learning dialogues. The topic is Indigenous partnerships in aquatic habitat management and restoration. We're privileged today to have Dan Benoit, former Aquatic Habitat Canada Steering Committee member, to host this session. The session here, we're in the intro and housekeeping. We'll have opening remarks by Dan, and then he'll introduce speakers, and we'll run through the speakers in this order on this rough time frame. And then we'll have the audience participation portion and the question and answer for the panel, and we'll conclude by 4 o'clock Eastern time. So I'm going to pass it over to Dan Benoit to introduce himself, provide some introductory remarks, and begin introducing our speakers for today. Dan.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Yeah, wow, lots of people, and I see that we have people outside of Canada, so welcome to everyone today. My name is Dan Benoit. I am a Métis from the Red River area, which is today Winnipeg, Manitoba. So I'm calling in from Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up partly in St. Norbert, which is part of one of the Métis parishes early on. And I also grew up on a farm, a small Métis farm, heritage breeds and seeds, mixed farming off the farm, income. And, it was a cultural thing. We hunted, trapped, fished, and did some off-farm type things. Métis farms still look like that today, a lot of them. My early work, I worked for a while with some First Nations as a consultant on the Northern Flood Agreement, which has an aquatic, component to that. What the hydro dams and everything else did to Indigenous peoples up there and the habitat that it destroyed. And then I worked for Métis governments. I worked for both the Manitoba Métis Federation as well as the Métis National Council. And that's where I really started to get introduced to conservation and species at risk and climate change and things like that. I'm also a traditional knowledge holder, not just a farm dude, I guess. And I also am a biologist by trade. And if you were to try to pin me on something, I'm a generalist, but I have been a fisheries biologist in the past. So today I am, again, calling in from Winnipeg area. In my former profession or life, I was part of the steering committee, but I am now the manager for a group called the Indigenous Science Liaison Office at Ag Canada, AASC. We can talk a little bit about that. We are there to incorporate and help Indigenous groups that are wanting to work with government scientists in the space of such things as agriculture and some of those species that are found in the shoreline, such as wild rice and things like that. Those are some of the conversations that we try to create between Indigenous groups and government scientists. I could talk about that all day, but I won't. What's really interesting is what I've noticed over time is that because of Section 35 rights and treaties and things like that, Indigenous voices in the space of aquatic habitat is becoming more and more important. And I think it's for a couple different reasons. One is it's for good management reasons. It's also for regulatory reasons. You know, whenever environmental assessments are done, they need to figure out what the effects on the Indigenous people would be when they affect aquatic habitat, for example. But also what we're seeing is that Indigenous knowledge can braid and weave into what Western science says about ecosystems and things like that. And so I think there's some really positive movements in that direction to, I won't say incorporate, but to weave in traditional knowledge and the work that Indigenous groups are doing in this field or in this space. Aquatic habitat is also important because of the biodiversity and the foods and the medicines and the cultural practices that occur within aquatic habitat. And so I think it's important as we move forward as a community called Canada that we need to find good, safe spaces that we can all talk about these issues, these conservation type issues. And aquatic habitat is just one of many spaces that we could be creating around this. So with that, a little bit of an introduction. So we're really very lucky and privileged to have a great panel here today of three speakers who are going to be presenting their experiences and some of the work that they are doing. Kathleen Ryan is of the Saginaw Ojibwe Nation. Jennifer Sylliboy is from and my apologies if I don't get the word right, Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, and Dr. Catherine Febria of University of Windsor's Health Headwaters Lab. So I believe that their presentations, because I've seen them, are going to be very thought-provoking. And hopefully this leads to a lively and rich conversation once they've done their presentations. The conversations themselves are going to be talking about Indigenous-led and co-led initiatives in aquatic habitat conservation, not conversation. Oh, we're going to have a conversation about conservation. So we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of presentation from each speaker, after which we will open up the stage for the audience to ask questions and maybe share some of their own experiences in this area. I see there's a lot of Indigenous people from Indigenous organizations that are participating here today, so that's great. And then we will move into questions that people can ask around to the speakers and others. So without anything further, we will open up to introduce our first speaker today, who is Kathleen Ryan. So Kathleen Ryan is an aquatic ecologist and independent consultant who has worked for the Saginaw Ojibwe Nation for the past 10 years and was part of the development of the Saginaw Ojibwe Nation Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. Over the last decade, she has worked to support several First Nations governments in the protection and assertion of their rights as it relates to lands, water, and wildlife. So Kathleen will talk today about her experiences with the Saginaw Ojibwe Nation Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. So Kathleen, if you're here, which I know you are, could you please start your presentation, please, and welcome.
Miigwech, Dan, Miigwech. Just give me 1 second to do my screen sharing here. Can everybody see that okay? I mean, people who can speak on the panel, can you guys see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
Looking
Okay.
good.
Okay, great. So Miigwech, Dan, thank you for that introduction. I'm really grateful and honored to be here and to get to share with so many people that I see joining. And also it's so amazing to see so many people from so many places across Turtle Island and outside of Turtle Island joining this conversation. I'm just going to start by introducing myself, but more just positioning myself and how I'm coming here to share with you today. And I am here to share about Saugeen Ojibwe Nation's Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. So like Dan said, and similar to what he said, I'm an aquatic ecologist sort of by trade, but the way or the approach or the perspective I have on aquatic ecology isn't just based on schooling. I think about aquatic ecology in terms of how it's connected to me and culture, to teachings, to story, to my clan, Turtle Clan, and some of the responsibilities I have there, to being a mother, to being a woman, and then also the years I've spent physically, you know, a lot of wetland work in wetlands, sort of learning with and from plants and animals, you know, picking them up, learning their names. It's really kind of formed, I think, a unique perspective and in line with what Dan said, that it's not sort of just aquatic ecology and this science vision that I'm coming from. It's really coming from all our relations, all my relations. So that's how I'm coming here to you today. And as Dan said, I worked with Saugeen Ojibwe Nation for a number of years. I'm now an independent consultant, but I'm still gratefully working with the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program team to plan and implement the program. And I'm kind of here today speaking as an ambassador for the program. So one of my main challenges is going to be talking about the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program in less than 20 minutes. So I really had to pick what I was going to talk about. So I'm really going to tell this as the story of the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. And I'm going to weave in some aspects that are really important relating to partnerships and then around habitat management and restoration, or what I would refer to as sort of protecting and caring for our relations. So yeah, with that, I will start this story. So like I said, I'm just going to tell the story of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. And I feel like some of these images sort of show just the beauty of this story. So before I start talking about the program, I'm going to talk a little bit about who Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is. I feel that it's important to ground this story in place and people. So I'm going to start with who is Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So the nation is comprised of two communities, Chippewas of Nawash and Ceded First Nation and the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation. Their people, together with their 2 million acres of territory, is what we consider the nation, all things together. So San has I'm going to refer to Saugeen Ojibwe Nation also as San for the rest of the time. San has a governing body, which is the Joint Council, and this council is tasked with making decisions about all ongoing activities and projects across the entire territory. The Joint Council created a body called the Environment Office around 2004, and this is really a technical body meant to support the Joint Council, especially as it relates to projects that have the potential to impact Aboriginal and treaty rights via environmental impacts. And this is the office where the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program is held and managed. So altogether, our collective goal is to uphold and protect the rights of San members, which I just said is directly linked with protecting the lands, waters, and non-human beings. I'll also say that a lot, non-human beings, and by that I mean everything in our environment that's not human. Some people like to say more than human beings. I'm good with that too. So just to, again, ground ourselves in place for this story. And again, I know people are joining from all over the place. So here you can see the Great Lakes. And then there's a red box that I'm going to zoom in on, which shows where Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is. So we call Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory Saugeen and Anishinaabe King. So the territory is a peninsula in Lake Huron, and it kind of separates Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. The territory includes everything that's there in the dark green, and then the darker blue shows us the area of lake territory, and this also includes the area encompassing San's exclusive commercial fishing grounds. So the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation people, as you can see by where they're grounded in place and have been since time immemorial, that water is important to San people, and the San would describe themselves as a fishing people. So San people have always been a fishing people, and they have proven this in the Canadian courts with their court-proven commercial fishing rights to the waters that I showed in the last slide of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And currently, SON members operate the largest Indigenous commercial fishery in the Canadian Great Lakes. And SON people would consider the fishery and the fish themselves integral to SON's way of life, economy, and culture. So as you can see by that map, that it is a very coastal territory, and the territory has about 500 kilometers of shoreline. The territory, and especially those shoreline areas, are very inundated by a lot of development pressures, and even more, say, over the last 10 years. If you're an Ontario resident, you might get this reference. We think that the territory, the peninsula, is sort of the new cottage country. Now that the Muskokas are full, like, this is the new place, and we're seeing all sorts of new developments in the shoreline region. So SON collectively has shared a lot of concerns about the scale and the increase in development, especially in those nearshore areas. And also the risk posed by not only individuals, say a cottage being built or a dock being built, but the cumulative impact of all of these developments taken together. Many of you will know who work in the Great Lakes that the overall health and conditions in the Great Lakes have changed drastically over the last 20 years. And we've identified in SON territory a number of stressors that are acting individually and cumulatively in this way. And I won't go through them all in detail, but I'd say some of the most striking ones are, of course, the changes that occurred in the lake due to invasive species. We currently are dealing with a lot of issues related to shoreline development, alterations, and hardening structures, especially after the high water levels we had in 2019 and 2020. We also have hundreds of aggregate operations, which is inland but affects overall water. And many other impacts. But when I start to think about partnership in the context of this conversation today, I wanted to point to one particular aspect in the territory that is very unique for SON. So within SON's territory, among all of these other developments and types of developments, we also house Bruce Power. And Bruce Power is the world's largest nuclear operating facility. It has 8 nuclear reactors operating at all times. The station is located at Douglas Point in SON territory on the Lake Huron side, and it's just south of the fishing islands, which, as you can tell by the name, are a very important part of the territory as a whole. But in terms of aquatic habitat, are I don't know how to say it. They're the bee's knees. I was trying to think of a funny fish pun there, but I couldn't come up with one. So I'll just show you for context. There's that picture of the territory again, and that black box there just shows the relative location of the Bruce Power operating stations. Again, not to belabor this, but just for a little bit of background. Nuclear operations has been happening on the shoreline here in SON territory since the 1960s, which started with 1 reactor at Douglas Point. OPG operated this plant for a long time, up to having 8 nuclear reactors. And then Bruce Power is a company who took over operations of this plant in 2001. Since the beginning of operations of this plant, SON members and leadership have expressed a lot of concerns about the environmental impacts of the nuclear generating station. And you'd think a lot of the concern would be about potential radiological impacts, and that is part of it. But one of the larger concerns is actually around impingement and entrainment of fish. So fish being pulled into the plant from the cooling water system, and then the release of heated water from the outfall of that same system. So we're looking at impingement and entrainment effects and thermal impacts, which, especially on the thermal side, it's a very complex question to address in terms of impacts. So in terms of SON and Bruce Power's relationship, of course, SON had been bringing up these concerns in a serious way for a long period of time. And SON and Bruce Power had entered into sort of our just consultation agreement of how we would communicate and do consultation together. And we had taken multiple approaches and many attempts to try to address some of these environmental impacts through, collaborative research programs and all sorts of mechanisms, but we really found no resolve to any of the issues to anyone's satisfaction, and no real benefit to the nation, and no real feeling in the nation that these impacts were being addressed, resolved, or that SON had the proper amount of, engagement. We were, however, able to identify pretty clearly some key uncertainties around the impacts of thermal and impingement entrainment, and some knowledge gaps that we could look to address. But again, we had no real way to close those gaps. And around 2017, 2018, we had sort of a turning point. And this had been after many years of discussions. And again, like I said, kind of hitting these walls in terms of making progress in terms of addressing these issues. And so we began real discussions about how SON would input, participate, and in Bruce Power's environmental monitoring, but also ways that SON could do its own environmental monitoring. So we had a regulatory turning point as well. There was a license renewal hearing that's done by the Nuclear Safety Commission, and they oversee all aspects of Bruce Power, all nuclear operations. And we had intervened with all our environmental concerns. And the CNSC proceedings actually resulted that Bruce Power needed to find ways to work with us. They needed to do some specific reports and some specific processes. But basically, the results of this regulatory point led us into the development of the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. But the real question, and this is sort of really in the partnership realm, and I wanted to make sure to make this a point, was CNSC, so the regulator and the company, had both said that they did not agree with SON's assessment. They felt that the level of impact, the level of risk was accurate, reasonable, and they did not think it was significant. But SON, we were adamant that there were concerned impacts that we couldn't understand and that no one understood. And so even though they didn't agree with the perspective we had or the position we had, they still respected that position and perspective and acknowledged that maybe they didn't fully understand it. And so this was sort of the bridging of those two issues. I feel like a lot of times in partnerships, you're partnering with people who maybe have a shared perspective, have a shared position, but it's also interesting of what's the value of partnering with people who maybe don't share your position or perspective as a way to sort of bridging that gap, as a way of learning from each other, of opening some doors of communication, of sharing, of sharing on everyone's terms, of information everyone can understand. So this is where we got to, because we knew that collectively we were not going to advance any of these serious issues we had by taking the same approach we had taken in the past, which was really that sort of regular consultation where reports were completed, they were sent to SON, we would, and then we spent forever just going back and forth with no real positive benefit, no real change, no real impact. So when we talked to Bruce Power and the regulator about how we thought we could resolve this, we shared our idea about the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. We thought that this monitoring program would be a new approach. It would support SON's ability to complete monitoring on its own terms, which means Bruce Power was required to do monitoring in a certain area. We felt more monitoring was required. We felt monitoring was required further south and north to understand what was happening at Bruce Power in terms of how everything is connected, just as an example. It also meant that any data we collected would have to be used in Bruce Power's environmental risk assessments and would be sent to the regulators as part of that process. And we knew the way we wanted to design the program, it would help us all collectively understand what was going on in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, which was at the time kind of outside of the scope of what Bruce Power was required to do. So this birthed the SON Coastal Waters Monitoring Program. And it's not meant to be only let's engage with Bruce Power. We really wanted to use this opportunity to say, what do we need to do in the environment of our territory when we know everything is connected? So we decided this program was going to be a long-term environmental monitoring program with the goal of understanding and protecting nearshore aquatic environments of SON territory. And we had 5 objectives. One was to complete a comprehensive baseline. One was to use this to assert SON's jurisdiction in the territory and enhance our ability to engage effectively. We wanted to create employment and training opportunities and to connect SON membership with the environment of their territory. And we want to embed SON knowledge systems and priorities of SON membership as a foundation for the work that we do. So we developed this program, and I'll show you a map in a second. In 2009, we actually were able to launch this program in the summer of 2009 or 2019. And that year, and for the last 3 subsequent years, we've been able to complete nearshore fish community monitoring, so FICNet, SANES, temperature monitoring, which includes, of course, when we're at the site. But I think last year we had 37 continuous temperature loggers in the lake. Water quality, which of course included sort of YSI measurements at sites, but also comprehensive water quality analysis for nutrients, contaminants, etc., wetland and aquatic plant assessments, and of course, at the base of all this is SON's ecological knowledge or SON's knowledge system. Here's just some pictures of the wonderful crew who has worked on this. I should also say, we started this program with 3 women from SON, and we now have 2 women still working in the program, and they have been the backbone of this program the whole time. And you'll see the amount of work they've been able to do is just extraordinary, impressive, beyond comprehension. So I'll just show you on the right, you can see here, this is a map that shows almost the whole SON territory. And this is from 2020. And you can just see, this shows all of the monitoring locations around the territory in 2020. So there's, of course, temperature sites, FICNet sites, SANE sites, but you can just see the sheer sort of volume of sites and information that was gathered that one year. And we're now just at the end of 2021. We were also able to use Pat Chow-Fraser's Wetland Fish Index and a special sort of version that was made for the territory to start to look at our data and look at the relative condition of sites. So you can see there on the left, we've sort of created this report card through the Wetland Fish Index to compare sites across the territory. And we were able to do this specifically in the area of Bruce Power as well. This just shows a zoomed in sort of version of the Bruce Power study area. And so we were able to look at the areas around Bruce Power. We were able to characterize the fish community and look at fish species diversity by region. And this just shows some water temperature data that encapsulates a larger area than would normally be looked at in terms of the differences between temperatures. So we're really just, it's 3 years in, but I feel like we're really just, we've got the 3 years and we've got our sort of foundation under us. The crew knows what they're doing. They feel confident in what they're doing. And now we're looking to sort of expand this even further. But what we know so far is our 3 years of being partnered with Bruce Power, what this enabled us to do that we wouldn't have been able to do without this partnership is we were able to develop a monitoring program for the entire SON territory. We were able to get the funding to actually start and maintain this base program, including salaries, training, the equipment we needed to start the program, vehicles. It also gave us a forum and a basis for discussion and information sharing between SON and Bruce Power that we didn't have before. And we weren't speaking on the same level. We didn't have sort of the relationship to share resources, share information, look at things together. It also helps us collectively, I mean, the regulator, the company, the nation, to understand the specific conditions in that environment relative to Bruce Power and then in relation to Lake Huron. It also helps us all to make determinations about impacts, changes and impacts over time, and helps us to consider climate change. We've also had other opportunities to collaborate on things we might not have been able to collaborate on, including Phragmites control, removal, and sort of studies about fish community and Phragmites near the Bruce Power site. We're both working on environmental DNA projects right now. In the context of Bruce Power, this would help us to identify with more accuracy the fish species that are being entrained. So this is larval fish and eggs that are very difficult to identify once they've been pulled into the plant. And it enables us to collaborate with Bruce Power looking at projects around climate change in Lake Huron. Additionally, and this relates to sort of the broader aspect of this presentation, is because of the program and being on the ground, Bruce Pirate also committed with us to complete multiple restoration or rehabilitation projects in San territory, and to work on that based on the data CWMP had collected and with SON member engagement. So we haven't gotten to that point of actually choosing those projects yet, but if we weren't doing this project on the ground and we didn't have staff working, doing this all the time, we wouldn't even be able to identify what those priority sites are. Here's just some nice pictures, a painted turtle and a golden shiner. So how is it going? I wanted to add some success and challenges here. So like I said, for the last 3 years, the Coastal Waters Monitoring Program have completed the most comprehensive data collection regarding the nearshore environments in the territory than any other agency in the territory has. No other agencies in the territory are collecting ongoing annual data like this relative to these nearshore environments. And that's also a reason we knew this was really important to do. And we're so grateful for that opportunity, that jumping off point to start the program. So now people are looking to us and all of the data we have. And that may be one of the challenges, is all of the data we have, but I'll get to that. So our field season has begun at ice out, so larval period, so March, April each year, and ending in the end of October. Like I said, we've completed this work each year with a maximum of 3 SON members carrying out the work as part of the team. So from 2019 to 2021, the crew has completed 168 nearshore fish community assessments, 117 larval fish tows. We have 37 continuous temperature loggers installed in the lake, and they have sampled 335,000 individual fishes. And we also have a huge volume of data regarding all of these things, as well as water quality and wetland vegetation. So because of all of this big work, there's some of the biggest challenges, and I feel that this is consistent with many First Nations, not all, but many, is capacity. We have a few people running on a decent but not a big enough budget to expand anything. We have capacity to keep this program going. We also have capacity, once we have all this data, we need the capacity to analyze the data, to turn the data into things that are meaningful, like maps and reports. We also lack, and again, this is another major problem with supporting First Nations in these initiatives, we also don't have access to sort of long-term funding that would support the growth of this type of program. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of First Nations face, is long-term funding that supports a long-term program. And that's what this program is. It's intended to be infinity. It's intended to go beyond what any of us can think. As long as we are there taking up space in the lands and waters, we want to be out doing this work. This is just another demonstration of 2019 and 2020 data, all of the various sites that were visited by the crew, and all of the sort of just the high level stats. This is some imagery from sites around the territory, just showing the great diversity in nearshore habitats. Because we have Lake Huron side is much more vegetated, shallow, warmer, has a lot more of these classic coastal wetland characteristics. And on the Georgian Bay side, there are some of those, but it's characterized by totally different habitats, totally different environments. You can see in the bottom right. So just showing all the types of habitats that and the diversity across the territory. And these are the types of sites that we would look at in terms of where there are opportunities to rehabilitate, to restore, to bring back to what it once was. So how I tie all this together is, like I said, the program really allows SON members to explore and connect with environments across the territory. The crew gathers their own observations while collecting data, talk to other SON members, and use all of this to learn about the health of our aquatic habitats and relatives. With SON people, with their eyes, their ears, their hearts on the ground, we believe we'll have the information needed to identify habitats and species that are suffering or degraded, and in need of our support, and more importantly, action. So we know that once we're able to do this, and now that we are able to do this, we can work with other partners, our main partner and other partners, and find opportunities to complete projects across the territory. You know, I've already talked about some of the commitments we have with Bruce Power about rehabilitation. And we know that we could leverage partnerships with other proponents or non-government organizations. And as part of that, we also know it's important to create forums for community workshops, to develop community-based ideas of what's important for restoration. Also, that's important because we don't have so much baseline. When we say we want to return something to what it was, sometimes we don't know what it was. And we won't know what it was unless we talk to people who were there, 20 years ago and know what that location was like before it was degraded, for example. And we also think moving towards actioning rehabilitation or restoration actions can create opportunities for community members or local people to volunteer or be trained and participate as part of any rehabilitation programs that we would do. Some more pictures of some fishes. And I know I don't have time to show this video, but after I'm gonna throw a link in the chat for everybody. The last 2 years, the team has made these really beautiful videos that show images from all across Sun Territory, many of the fish species that they find. They're really powerful, awesome videos. So I'll throw the link in the chat after this, and I hope people go check it out. So I don't know how long I talked. Nobody cut me off, so I must not be too bad. But Chimigwet for the opportunity to share. I've included here the contact info for Alicia Jones and Emily Manser. They're the environmental technicians that have been working on the program for a number of years, and then my own contact information as well. So with that, Chimigwet.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. That was so. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, and you're perfect time-wise, so that's fine. A couple minutes over is nothing between us. So, I just want to point out. So, there's been a few questions and comments. So we're going to be doing questions at the end. So, just so you know. And yes, this is taped, so it will be available on the Aquatic Habitat Canada website later on. I unfortunately deleted someone's question. Well, I answered it, but anyways, it was a glitch on my part. I did answer it, but there was a question, but we'll refer back to it at the end. I can see it here still. So our next speaker is Jennifer Sylliboy, or Sylliboy, sorry, researcher, integrative knowledge systems. Now, this is the second time I'm probably going to butcher this, so my apologies, Jennifer. Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources. So Jennifer is Mi'kmaq from the Eskasoni First Nation. She works for the Aquatic Research and Stewardship team at the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, focusing on integrating Western science and Mi'kmaq knowledge systems through TwoEyed Seeing as it relates to aquatic and fisheries management. Just as a funny side note, sometimes I can't even get my own name right, so don't take it personal if I can't always pronounce some of these Indigenous names properly. So my apologies, Jennifer. So I'll let you take it away. You're there, I assume. And that was a great presentation, Kathleen. I'm just echoing some of the comments in the comment section.
I'm just catching my breath now to watch Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Great presentation, Kathleen. My name is Jennifer Sylvoy. I work for the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, so really close there, Dan. I'm a researcher and project manager in integrative knowledge systems. And I want to thank you for attending today's webinar hosted by Aquatic Habitat Canada. So I come from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and ceded territory of the Mi'kmaq in present-day Atlantic Canada. From 1725 to 1761, the Mi'kmaq and British Crown entered into a series of treaties that are known as the Peace and Friendship Treaties. The Mi'kmaq treaties are about relationship and diplomacy and maintaining and structuring relationships between diverse nations, Aboriginal and European. The treaties established political order intended to prescribe nation-to-nation relations in the context of coexistence, not to surrender land or resources or as subjects of the British Crown. So the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, or UNWR, is an organization that represents the 5 Mi'kmaq communities of Unama'ki. Our goals are to provide resources for Mi'kmaq equal participation in natural resource management, to strengthen Mi'kmaq research and natural resource management while maintaining our traditions and worldviews, to partner with other groups sharing the same desire to protect and preserve our resources for future generations. So today I want to start with a little bit about community and engagement. So science paired with Mi'kmaq traditional knowledge is the key to UNWR's aquatic research activities. This unique pairing has been called TwoEyed Seeing, which I will get into shortly, and brings together the best of Western science and traditional knowledge. UNWR's research is guided by our communities and the advice and guidance of our community's elders. Community involvement is the heart of everything we do. We know that Mi'kmaq are assets, and their involvement strengthens projects. Community engagement helps your project to run smoothly by helping identify roadblocks which might otherwise blow out the timeframes and cost of a project that you are running. It provides opportunities to enhance capacities, and where UNWR has limited capacity, involving fishers is important toward achieving our research goals. You also gain a better understanding of the community's needs and aspirations. When you understand the community's perspectives, you can also frame and communicate your project in a way that hits the mark and is aligned to the community's top priorities. And finally, it creates a greater sense of community ownership. Community members have a deep and intimate knowledge of their local area, as well as scientific, technical, historical, and cultural insights. Involvement means people feel like they have played their part in the positive outcomes and will ensure its success. So in the East, we value a concept referred to as Edwaptamunk, or Two-Eyed Seeing. This is a concept developed by Elder Albert Marshall, his late wife Mardina, and Dr. Cheryl Bartlett. Two-Eyed Seeing refers to seeing from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye, the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and using both these eyes together for the benefit of all. And Albert's concept on Two-Eyed Seeing is now world renowned. It refers to the gift of multiplicity. Albert thought, wouldn't it be great if everyone thought like Mi'kmaq people? As Mi'kmaq, we are excellent two-eyed seers. It's how culture survived through adaptation. Now, Albert is a visionary. He doesn't tell you how to do two-eyed seeing, but he does provide some insights. Albert tells us that two-eyed seeing is about co-learning. It's about the opportunity to co-produce knowledge using the best of Western and Indigenous knowledge. What Albert is talking about is not what we know, it's how we know what we know, the knowledge system. Many people come to the table not fully understanding Indigenous knowledge or even their own knowledge system. This creates a very limited view of knowledge. Fundamental to two-eyed seeing is knowing what knowledge is, whether it is Western knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. The approach that UNWR brings to two-eyed seeing is based on a knowledge system, not the knowledge itself. We prefer to think of knowledge as a verb. It's how we know rather than the what we know. When we refer to Indigenous knowledge, we often think of what we know, and it is to some degree. We see this in terms of local ecological knowledge, like where to find the fish, where to hunt, when to do these activities, and the environmental cues that indicate when certain events are about to occur. But knowledge is a system, whether it's Indigenous or Western, community or institutional. This knowledge system is comprised of many things: what we know, how we practice our knowledge, how we adapt to it, and how we transmit knowledge are the elements most people are familiar with. But the values and underlying beliefs that are also part of a knowledge system are often ignored. And this is problematic because often the values and beliefs are at odds between cultures, creating a barrier to collaboration. There are two challenges in two-eyed seeing process from the beginning. The first is that we don't understand each other's knowledge system, and the second is that we don't understand our own knowledge system. So Western science is referred to as science-based knowledge. It is a systematic verification process to test questions from observations. Western knowledge attempts to produce empirical information that can be repeatedly generated and is designed to reduce bias. Western sciences value written transmission of knowledge, Western science values statistics, and Western science values a certain way of knowing. Indigenous knowledge is somewhat more complicated and is less understood by Western societies. Indigenous knowledge is the relationship with the natural world. It is lived and is what one does rather than what one knows about. It is distinct and highlighted as different from Western science. It is knowledge that is embedded in cultural frameworks that are rooted in the land and cannot be separated from the roles and responsibilities of the culture. Like other knowledge systems, it expands and contracts in relation to wider social and ecological processes. Indigenous knowledge systems in particular are driven by ethics as part of the value system, and governance is implied. It's also not easy for just anyone to understand Indigenous knowledge. It requires Western scientists and resource managers to transcend worldviews and recognize the uniqueness of Indigenous knowledge as a standalone system. It is not universal or pan-Indigenous. It is place-based knowledge that may come from many sources. It requires empowered participation at multiple levels, decision-making, technical, and managerial. So in our experience, TwoEyed Seeing is a potential solution to incorporating Indigenous knowledge. Here, values specific to each perspective are negotiated while respecting the underlying beliefs of both Western and Mi'kmaq knowledge systems. It encourages research practices that build self-governance capacity and encourages innovative and transformative processes. It aligns ethics with goals and values, and it's an invitation for co-learning and co-production to build adaptive capacity. One of its strengths is that it is process-based. So one example is TwoEyed Seeing as a tool is seen through our salmon consultation table. The Mi'kmaq have fished salmon for as long as they have existed. It's an important part of our cultural identity. However, Mi'kmaq were restricted in where and how many salmon they could take. Following a record high returns of salmon to one of the rivers, they felt that they did not get their fair share and were never consulted on the impact of the recreational fishery was having on the availability of salmon for Mi'kmaq people's food, social, and ceremonial needs. There was pressure from the Mi'kmaq to have the Crown initiate consultation, and there were no similar processes in place for consulting. And another thing is the Mi'kmaq Nation did not have one voice. After a couple of years following the request from the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia to consult with First Nations, DFO did engage in consultation using what is referred to as the consultation table. Representatives were present from the federal and provincial governments who have authority for managing salmon in Nova Scotia. Rivers in the national parks are under the jurisdiction of Parks Canada. The province of Nova Scotia issues licenses for salmon fishing, but the responsibility to manage diadromous fish species falls on DFO. This was a significant opportunity for many things. It was the first opportunity for inclusion and input as a unified voice. There is opportunity to build relationships with the scientists and resource managers, many of which we did not have existing relationships with. This would not have been possible without the creation of working groups that were off record so that discussion and, importantly, co-learning could take place. The table meets twice a year, and this is a typo, is now in the 9th year of operation. Working together can be quite challenging. For our salmon consultation table, it took a couple of years to understand that our underlying beliefs and value systems were very different. From this process, we learned a few things and have been able to incorporate them into other partnerships, such as our Abobanamadultik project. So this was one of our first projects where we were working with academic institutions and came with some challenges. Academic institutions are very Western science-based, and it took time for them to embrace another way of doing things. However, with some communication and several meetings, we were able to overcome this, and they were able to embrace other ways of doing things. Another project was our collaboration with Mi'kmaq Fishers for a Margarine and Mabu River Habitat Restoration Project. This project began on shaky footing, but using TwoEyed Seeing as a tool, we are able to overcome challenges to be included as full partners. With those project challenges, it became easier to partner. Then came our lobster habitat improvement project, our reef wall project, which had a number of partners throughout Nova Scotia and is a habitat offsetting project over 4 years. This project is managed by UNWR, and the lobster fishers meanwhile lobster fishers were used in the involvement for site selection. Our newest project is our eSurf salmon tracking in the Northwest Atlantic, and it is a very large project with a number of partners, 59 to be exact. It includes DFO, Indigenous, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and NOAA. There are 11 AROMs funded with this. It is Indigenous partnership led by UNWR. We also have an Indigenous partnership coordinator, and we contract local fishers to help us with the tagging and sampling. So despite some challenges and setbacks, several successes are noted in our partnership journeys. We are improving technical capacity through collaboration. We are continuing to improve the management of aquatic species and habitats. And greater collaboration has allowed for the timely receipt of information to the scientists, stakeholders, and rights holders as needed. Governance is co-evolving to address any gaps, and Mi'kmaq advisory committees are being created to fill gaps in communities to ensure fishers and other knowledge holders' voice are represented in the process. We are also able to balance cultural expression with conservation. So as a Mi'kmaq organization, we value insights from Western science, and we also value our own ways of knowing and being. Given the interest in TwoEyed Seeing, reconciliation, and the need for many projects to collaborate and partner with Indigenous peoples, we created a set of 10 partnership tenets to provide guidance on how this can be achieved with UNWR. So going back to what Elder Albert Marshall says about TwoEyed Seeing is that the gift of multiple perspectives is treasured by many Aboriginal peoples, and explains that it refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and to using both of these eyes together for the benefit of all. So these are our partnership tenets. So number one, engage early. Co-development of the project is expected. Number two, relevance of the project is key to our participation. The project outcomes must benefit UNWR or the Mi'kmaq community's interests. Three, partnerships must be based on equality. This is expressed as shared decision-making. How the project is developed, implemented, and communicated must be through a partnership arrangement integrated within the project. Four, the preferred project governance arrangement is a steering committee. In this forum, all partners have an equal voice in project implementation and co-development of research questions, research methods, and methodologies, products, and communications. The expectation is that terms of reference will be co-developed with an emphasis on shared decision-making, roles and responsibilities clearly identified, and can address how data is to be used and shared, and incorporation of a conflict resolution process. Five, be aware that some projects may involve a local ethics review, and this takes time. Six, research must have minimal impacts to the environment, including to the species studied, community involvement, and the environment as examples. We encourage potential partners to work with us to integrate ways we can minimize harm, yet meet the research criteria to ensure a successful project. Seven, budgets must be co-developed and incorporate the added expense of collaborative governance within the project. Eight, resources to hire a community liaison have been successful in past projects and is recommended to ensure the project is supported by the resources necessary for its success. Co-authorship is expected on primary publications, project reports, and gray literature. Any project-related communication products, websites, social media, brochures, posters, etc., must be co-developed. These tenets can be found on our website, link here, and they are based on Mi'kmaq values and experiences and lessons learned when partnering with other organizations. They assert how we want to partner and outlines our expectations when partnering. I do want to reiterate that partnership and collaboration is a process and relationship building is the foundation. So to conclude, I want to share some final thoughts. So moving forward from this experience, we are often asked, how can we incorporate Indigenous knowledge in fisheries management? Well, here are some key lessons learned from our experience. Shared space is needed for co-learning. Cross-cultural learning is fundamental to TwoEyed Seeing, and to do this, Indigenous peoples need to be included, but included in a way that is not tokenism. Meaningful engagement and preferably partnerships are needed. Don't shy away from any tensions. It's those tensions where TwoEyed Seeing is needed. Challenges are expected, and especially when knowledge systems collide. When working with Indigenous peoples, it's important to decolonize. This doesn't mean throw away colonialism. This means respecting and understanding there is more than one way to look at the world. And this is informed by culture and history. Knowledge systems are important. Understanding your own knowledge system is necessary. How do you acquire knowledge? What makes knowledge credible for you? And what are your values? And lastly, the roles and values shape what and how we do things. And they may not be explicit, so it may take time for values to surface. That concludes my presentation for today. Bulalio, and thank you for your time. And here's some contact info.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's really funny because I was typing in the chat. Someone had a question about the differences about traditional knowledge and Western way of seeing things. And then you, just as I'm typing away your great slide that kind of shows the differences and similarities between the two knowledge systems and everything you were talking about it. So I quickly said, oh, and Jennifer's dealing with it right now. So anyways, that was great. If I had realized that you're going to do such a great job, I would have just left it to you to do. I guess what I'm trying to do as a host is try to clean up some of the questions that we can, because I think we're going to have lots of questions at the end, and I'd love to be able to answer them all. So, and thank you, Kathleen. I see that you're actually answering questions as well, so that'll free up some time at the end as well. So, okay, thank you, Jennifer. That was really interesting. And so now our last guest speaker is going to be Dr. Kathleen Febria. Yeah, okay. So Dr. Febria is an immigrant settler who is currently based out of the University of Windsor in Ontario, where she is the Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor in Freshwater Restoration Ecology and Director of the Healthy Headwaters Lab. She will speak today about her experiences in building science partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And I'm not a very good co-host because I should have hammered down everybody's names and communities where they're from, so I'm not so tongue-tied, so my apologies for Kathleen for maybe not getting your name quite right. So.
You did it great. Can you hear me okay? I just switched my,
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll just maximize my screen. I think we did this last time. I think I need to switch the screen. If someone could let me know, or does it look fine?
No, you look good. You look good right
Okay.
now. Yeah.
Okay, good. That was different from the practice, so glad it works. Good afternoon or good morning from wherever you are in Turtle Island or beyond. It's a real privilege to be here today. I'm really grateful and humbled to be invited by Aquatic Habitat Canada and to hold space with these amazing females on this panel. I've learned so much from you and just really enjoyed just being here and bearing witness to your presentation. So I'll just lead off by saying I'm a non-Indigenous scientist. I'm coming from the lens of a freshwater scientist, and it's, you know, in deep gratitude that I come to you here in community and in kinship with in relationship to water. So I'll be talking to you through stories and some data around the relationship and the journey that I've taken to pursue a research career in restoration. I'm grateful to be working in the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, otherwise known as Windsor region and Windsor, Essex. I am an immigrant from the colonized islands of the Philippines, and English systems, Western systems, all of these are not Indigenous to me. So I've learned and grown and become, found a home and a community with anyone that's passionate about water and thinking about what we can do to restore it and protect it for future generations. I will touch a little bit about part of my journey, which brought me to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so all of that is wrapped up in a story today around how one person in one lab has taken an approach to really try and respond and answer the call and do our best with the responsibility we have to care for water. Much of the work we do is centered here in the Great Lakes and Turtle Island. And so that's where I'm going to be talking to you mostly about. And I'll just start with a couple of things that I know to be true. And I've given lectures on this before, and I'm happy to share the link. So I'll just touch on it. And then if you want a link or some papers about it, please feel free to message me later. One thing I know to be true is that we are standing in the middle at the start of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. It is a call to action for communities locally and globally to take care and protect Mother Earth by thinking about how we can curb losses of biodiversity and erosion off our landscapes into the water ecosystems, and really take a coordinated approach, and that this is a critical time to do that. I also know by being in this space that our Indigenous knowledge systems, which I use as a collective term that speaks to traditional Indigenous knowledge, as people have called it, this long-term knowledge system to be very aligned with ecology. So the type of biology that I pursue, this idea of holism and interactions from the molecular scale all the way up to the whole planet being highly connected. And I also know that when we look at examples of when sustainability have been achieved, they have been in examples here in Canada and Turtle Island when our Indigenous partners and communities' voices and gifts have been amplified, centered, and maximized, and that the science responds or is alongside that. And I know that to be true also from research partners that I've worked with in Aotearoa. I also know that when I think about the Great Lakes, I think about the trees, and I think about humans and our relationship to the water because of what we do on the land, both in interacting with the beings on the landscape and how water runs off the land, interacts with organic matter. And so my training as a freshwater ecologist really has been thinking about the smallest of the streams, the transportation of leaf litter into our waterways, invertebrates that might shred the different leaves, algal communities. And it's really my early Western science training has been thinking about these small, underappreciated waterways, wetlands, intermittent streams, temporary waterways that get culverted, buried, demolished, and lack legal protections from further disruption. And this was the issue decades ago when I started in the science space in my training, and it continues to be an issue today. So how do we want to go about doing that in the Healthy Headwaters Lab? We are in year 3 of this program, 2 of which have been under the cloud of a pandemic, but we launched in a way that was really thinking about our values and a way and a process for conducting science that was decolonial or tried to be decolonial. This is, and I'm speaking for me and not everybody in the group, we are all on a journey, but really thinking about how could we harness different knowledge systems, ways of knowing, ways of doing to achieve a more community responsive approach to the science that's being pursued. And that this, by doing something different, is an example of transformative change. The outcomes being not just the peer-reviewed science, but beneficial outcomes for society as our communities define them to be. And this is one of the things, or these different threads of activities and outcomes that lead and underpin research excellence in today's day and age. I was asked to identify a few key messages, and one of them is this thread of centering and amplifying Indigenous and local knowledge systems to restore our aquatic habitats. And the ways that I've addressed this in the better part of this last decade has really shifted my methodology as a scientist. Embedding and learning and developing processes and protocols for working in a way that could be community responsive, community led and driven, and it looks different in every community. It also was a recognition and awareness of the need to network and embed and align experiments at the same time as trying to pursue science. So still, leaving space to interrogate processes, but also thinking and always having at top of mind this idea that it needed to lead to some sort of outcome that our communities were looking for. So it's a very intentional, decentralized, decolonized knowledge co-production process. And also this recognition based on all of the evidence that we have so far is that restoration takes time. So how can we use things like investing in relationships and the social infrastructure to ensure that the ecological outcomes that we want can be achieved, not necessarily within our generation, but for future generations. So we spent the better part of the last few years really thinking about a holistic way of doing our science. And this is one example, a very circular way of thinking about what knowledge systems should we engage and investing in those relationships first. So before we actually took a water sample, we actually spent the better part of our first year just listening and walking farm fields, learning from the land, to identify and listen for what are the kinds of questions that we should be asking, not the ones that I could come into the room knowing or onto the farm field saying that this is what we should answer, but how could we co-create a research project, its design and the outcomes in a way that was beneficial for all of those involved. And from the beginning, embed and plan for multiple ways of mobilizing that knowledge, loops so we could get feedback throughout the process, and really address the kinds of decision-making uncertainty gaps and barriers that were at play in the context where our science is being conducted. One example is that we have a farm advisory board, a mixture of settler and Indigenous farmers, stewards of the land that are all interested in what, like Kat said, have different views. Kathleen mentioned having different views, to engaging those throughout the science process so it keeps us honest. And the conversations we have are far ranging, but really implementing a process where we can report back to the different farmers that we work with, the different communities we work with, to talk about what are the kinds of questions, how has the farming season gone, what are you thinking about next year? Because ultimately, planning and research farmers as part of our science team. And so these are just a few names of the people that have been closely involved in that part of our project. It also means carving off and prioritizing research funding to establish a knowledge circle in our group called Odaimi. And here are some of the faces in the community that we work with. And this idea that there are multiple, how do we center the knowledge in a science lab? And I wanted to acknowledge Candy, one of the co-partners in this, that's really helped to center our lab's voice and thinking and way of navigating through this, so that we were always thinking about the relationships that we were building and how we could regularly and transparently show up for the communities we are wanting to work with and serve. And so the kinds of work that we have been able to do is deliver one of the first land-based traditional ecological knowledge courses from the University of Windsor, with Clint Jacobs as the lead instructor. And there's a case study on that offering. If it wasn't due to COVID, we might have offered this a few more times, but we hope to bring it back soon, where the course is entirely takes place at Bikejunong. Students came to the land and not only learned about Western science concepts, but also learned from knowledge keepers from the land and embraced it and engaged in ceremony and just their own relationship journey with the landscape and the community. And it was a real privilege to be part of that, as well as an open house where we brought together community members and researchers simply to share stories and to build, again, this community of partners wanting to grow and move forward in this space. It also means understanding, which I think Dan mentioned earlier, not just thinking about what we plant, so corn, but the understanding the ceremony and participating in the ceremony around it, and understanding these beings, where did those seeds come from, and how it's just been really a privilege to be invited to participate and learn the ceremony involved with the plant beings that are also being farmed so expansively in this region. And likewise, it also involves responding to the requests and building our own relationships between the youth and the university community. So here at Bikejunong Eagle Keepers coming to the Freshwater Restoration Center, seeing some of the research facilities we have, engaging in some ecological monitoring, and also opening spaces for someone like Mariah Alexander, an artist, to sit with us and learn with our lab about traditional ecological knowledge and finding ways to express that knowledge and understanding in other ways than a Western science sort of framework. And this is one of the pieces that she created through her our artist in residence opportunity for her. It also means that we've created infrastructure to have our research and ecological services available for hire, inclusion, and grants. Also, our ability to create a pathway and the service of doing water and sediment quality analyses in the lab, and having trained technicians to do benthic identification as well. And so it just offers a number of different services that communities can access if they're interested in having a science lab play a role. And throughout all of it, we have a mechanism or a framework for trying to return information about what we're doing in the community back to the community. So people in the Bikeshanon community will have seen our newsletters a couple times already, and we've had a couple of webinars. And likewise, our farming communities will have returned the number of information in a newsletter, not only data about what we collected on their farm fields, but also the larger context within which that science is sitting and the kind of science technology that we've been able to pursue through these sorts of partnerships on the landscape. So there's a really cool analogy about carbon characterization using a knitting analogy that one of our students has put out that has worked really well in explaining some of the technicalities of the science. So that's kind of one example of how, or a number of different examples for that first key message. And this is all built on this idea and this recognition. What I know to be true is that when we create these partnerships, we generate co-benefits, and they ultimately help achieve this goal of habitat restoration. I've worked on this for the better part of the last decade in Aotearoa, and here pictured here is the South Island or Te Waiponamu. And in this time, this region, which is known for, river floodplain systems, is also very much like the Great Lakes, low gradient ecosystems that have been completely intensified agriculturally. These are mostly cow farms, dairy farms, and the water quality issues are very similar to what we're experiencing here in the Great Lakes. I won't talk too much about it, but simply say there are presentations and various papers about this. This work came from this umbrella experiment called CAREX, where we did a agricultural stream restoration experiment on 10 different farms across the region, worked in partnership to try and find more nature-based solutions to agricultural water quality issues. And so there's a case study about that. And it's this idea that when we brought different knowledge keepers, funding agencies, and communities together, we were able to do far more by working in partnership than if we were to work in isolation. And this is one farm and one catchment where one stream, we were able to amplify a wetland replanting, secure science funding to do more discovery-based and blue skies type research on some of the monitoring data we were able to work with. We engaged chemistry, microbial scientists to look at some additional science questions outside of our realm. We were able to amplify riparian planting beyond one farm, but to across a whole catchment. The local schools got involved in fundraising and crowdsourcing more replanting within that whole catchment. And what was really meaningful was the fact that farmers and our decision makers, governments were telling us that our newsletters that we created, about 50 of them in 5 years, they would read those more than the scientific papers or listen to the radio show more than anything else. And so this mobilization, as we were learning, even when mistakes came, it was facilitated by this relationship we made with our communities around what we were learning, why, what we were doing, and really trying to create outcomes on farm fields in the community that we could all learn from together. There's a YouTube video as well with one of my partners, a cultural management advisor, where he would meet with farming communities and Mana Whenua, Maori communities and leaders to come and talk about these shared visions and values about how restoring riparian zones and wetlands and thinking about sustainable farming was very much aligned with what the community and what Mana Whenua would want for this region. So I invite you to watch and from his own words, listen to his narrative. But this all led to, as I'm going through this process, this idea, which is what others have mentioned today on today's panel, that we really need to rethink how we fund and pursue science and the systems that they're being conducted under, and really thinking about investing in partnerships, these long-term partnerships, which Kathleen mentioned, as well as Jennifer talking about how these are really more of a sustainable pathway socially, but also ecologically, and really offers these wonderful opportunities for innovation. I know this to be true because this is happening. This is a community, a global community I continue to be involved in with the science community in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Pictured here are half Maori, half non-Maori scientists at different age stages, different levels and ranks across ecological physics, science, scientists operating at the national federal level, really thinking about how the culture of science needs to shift in a way that is really individually at the lab level, institutionally, and sort of globally shift to be more inclusive and really centering some of our responsibilities as a science community to ensure that we can achieve science that also supports these better outcomes for society. This builds on a growing change in funding agencies, and one that I continue to be involved in is the Biological Science Challenge, the Biological Science Funding Agency for Aotearoa, New Zealand, where from the beginning, a very systems designed approach has been a way that weaves Matauranga Māori traditional knowledge with science communities, and the public together as one innovation system, so that they're not, siloed, but all focused on this idea that if we can bring our knowledges and innovations together, we can truly achieve a global vision, a national vision around halting the decline of biodiversity in this country. And so I know it's happening. I know funding systems are changing. I know there are global conversations around when we take a more inclusive approach, the outcomes are actually better. And we're slowly starting to see these larger funding organizations and systems to change. But in my view, it just felt really, that's not enough. And we as an individual and lab group or a science team can also make change. And this is especially important, as all of you know, in the light of recognizing our rights and responsibilities as a community and here in Turtle Island, and working towards reconciliation. So it really, in our everything that we do in the lab, is really thinking about how can we reimagine research and teaching? How can we deal with grants and stretch them and bend them? How can we create more spaces to try and do what we think is research that should proceed in a good way? And it's been hard, I'm not gonna lie, but I think it is certainly worth the effort when we think about the future generation and what's at stake. So one way we can visualize a more resilient system, at least in our lab, is we've been taking a note of all of the different grants that we write and receive. And so when you think of these teal boxes here being just the HHL, meaning like our operations and the equipment we use, IKC meaning the funding we've allocated and committed for our Ode'inin, and a similar mechanism for our farming board and additional grants. We, from the beginning, have engaged our partners in Indawabjeg or Bekeshanong. And we've kept track of in what ways these grants are in relationship to one another. And what we've observed over time is just how much of those resources can amplify other projects, and how this resilient web of funding has allowed us to really proceed with research that is integrative and leading to really more fruitful outcomes. So what's an example of that? Instead of just looking at tillage versus non-conservation tillage, we've engaged more than 30 farmers to have a restoration gradient to see how does carbon change across that land-water interface. It's allowed us to rethink carbon as a tracer in these human impacted systems and reframe biodiversity, whether it be phragmites or ditches. What is living there and how are they living in relationship to one another? It's allowed us to work in partnership with our practitioners and governments to build and bring together data sets to think about not just species at risk, but the relationship between freshwater mussels and the broader benthic communities. And as we continue to expand across the traditional territory, it allows us to really think and bring data sets together so we can quantify at a broader environmental scale things like, what is the impact of moving freshwater mussels or species at risk because of things like translocation? And so we're moving into spaces where we're allowing these partnerships and these conversations to evolve to lead towards questions that can really direct and speak to kinds of the policy changes and protocols that might be better suited to helping ensure that species at risk can survive things like translocation. So with that being said, it's been a real privilege for us to then take a sidestep and have the Bekeshanong lead grants, and for them to hire us out to provide research services or training services. And this was a wonderful example this past summer where we in different ways came out to talk about storytelling, to engage in freshwater mussel surveys, to come to the university, and to even use research services for water and ecological monitoring. And this is a journey that we're still continuing to grow. And so I think with this talk, I'm hoping that anyone in the group who are thinking about partners and wanting to think about training the next generation might think about a program that we're part of called Fishcast. It requires that graduate students, early career researchers, spend time doing internships with various partners in addition to the scientific research that they do, to really, I think, model from the beginning of their training just how important partnership development truly is. And so with that, I think I filled my time up. I just wanted to say thank you to the homies. There's so many rich experiences within this group, and it's been a privilege to work with you all. So Chimigwach, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So yeah, hey, thanks, Catherine. That was really good. No, you're not taking questions just quite yet. I think we're gonna be
Right, that's right, the panel. I'm stop sharing
that's
now, aren't I?
fine. You're eager. Yeah. That's great. That is great. So I'm going to turn it back to David. He's going to talk a little bit about our next part, but I want to thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I may want to throw in a couple cents myself in the question and answers, because you brought up some really good points. Okay, David.
Yeah, I'm just a bit of the timekeeper. I think we're doing pretty good on time in the webinar. Really excellent presentations, and I see questions being populated. So please if you have a question for the panelists, hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type it in there. But before we do that, I think we have 10 minutes or so that where we wanted to open it up to the audience. Not so much for questions, but for sharing experience and perspective that you want to share with the larger group that we have today. I think it's just over 200 at this point. So to do that, if you feel like you have something you'd like to share, or a piece you'd like to say for 1 or 2 minutes, I would encourage you to hit the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you do that, then I can open you up to allow you to speak and address people. And if there's no takers, we'll move on to a panel conversation, and we may end up in a back and forth there as well that's productive. But just wanted to take a moment to, if there's anyone wants to share an experience or a perspective beyond just the Q&A. And I'll give it a moment here. I see I've got 2 hands up right now. So I see Sama. I will open you up here. I think you're unmuted, Sama, and
Hi.
yeah, go right ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, actually. This is Dr. Sama Al-Maroufi. I am professor at University, Aurelia campus. I'm originally a biologist specialized in wetland restoration. Originally from Iraq.
If you turn your camera on, we'd all be able to see you as well, which would be wonderful.
Oh,
but you don't
excellent.
have to.
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed
That's
to have
fine.
Yeah, I don't know if I can see, I can't turn it on.
Just go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, originally from Iraq. I worked actually in the restoration program for the Mesopotamia marshes, the original Middle Eastern marshes, one of the huge wetlands in the Middle East, and it's actually occupied with marsh dwellers, which is the let's say the Aboriginal, or the original community of the Mesopotamia land, and I can see a lot of similarity about how to address what is the knowledge about indigenous knowledge. And I always refer to the instinctive knowledge, which is completely different than what we the learn that we got from education. So what's how I think what Jennifer was trying to establish is a differentiation between education and knowledge, and I found it's really interesting to know that there is a huge difference between what you read and you educate yourself and learn about things, and things that you born taught how to do and taught how to learn about. And that was very, very interesting. And I've seen it through our communication with marsh dwellers and understanding the culture, especially the marshes in the Mesopotamia dried for over 13 years. And when we started to indate it again, and it was kind of a new ecosystem for us, especially like I'm a new generation to understand the history of Mesopotamia marshes. And when started to do that actually work on restoring these marshes, a lot of Western communities and agency were interested, and for that reason, I remember when I started working with the Canadian International Development Agency, who had a huge fund to work on the Mesopotamia marshes, and through that program, I came here to Canada, finished my education, and went back to work again at the marshes, and until 2016, and I came back here to Canada, and yeah, it was really interesting to see how understanding ecosystems globally is important to have a one set of dialogue to help our ecosystem and help our environment. Kathleen talked a little bit about globalization and understanding, and also Catherine, both of them talked about how important is to not to work locally, but use the local experience to understand how we can incorporate our knowledge globally. So I am very interested, because I teach environmental sustainability, and I see that as an environmental specialist, we have a huge responsibility to connect everybody in this world, because we all share the environment, we all share our earth, so we all have the right to learn and exchange knowledge about how to protect our environment. Also, one important thing that Caitlin were talking about, how they were SON were trying to identify the significant impact, and unfortunately BP did not recognize their effort in understanding why there is a significant impact that they weren't aware of. When I teach environmental monitoring practices and application, I always tell my students, we don't only focus on direct impact. Direct impact, things that you can see, like you go to the field, you see there's a lot of fish are dying, or there is the color of the water is changing, or there is a lot of algae blooms. So these things that it's actually telling us what is going on, but there are a lot of indirect impact that it comes from very minor impact of certain parameters that it's over time. Yes, it's less in concentration or in quantity, but the accumulation of these a little bit that it's been added to the environment will show later on. And this is what we tell, that, okay, don't only focus on the things that you see, try to think what these things gonna cause later. So I think this is kind of a point where yeah, sorry.
I'll just ask you, yeah, the lived experience versus formal education, and the direct versus indirect, really good, and the parallel to other parts of the world are great things to bring up. I do want to move on to another experience. I got one other hand up here, so thanks very much, Sama, and I think maybe the panelists might reflect on that. So I'm just going to switch this over. Oops, and where did you go?
Rob Best is next.
Yeah, he's moving around on my screen.
Oh, I'll try to stay still.
There we go. There we go. Go ahead, Rob.
No, I appreciate that. I think where I'm coming from with this is, internally, I have these discussions in my head all the time on, for context, I'm a senior aquatic ecologist. I'm based in Calgary, Alberta, but I grew up in Southern Ontario. My family's from Caledon and Port Elgin. So fairly aware of the issues that are going on around there. But I have these internal discussions in my head that how do we, as for myself as a consultant, how do we encourage our clients to, include purposeful commitments or the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in our, technical deliverables or monitoring program requirements that are above and beyond regulatory obligations. The first couple of presentations when we're talking about Bruce Power, I think are really great success stories. And what I would encourage, through this discussion or others, is that we remember that those success stories need to be shared with people outside of those that are attending this presentation, because, I'll speak for myself. I join these presentations because I find great value in hearing different perspectives. And often the messaging kind of stops with the people that are here, and it doesn't kind of trickle back to those that we talk to in our daily lives. So, I would encourage us all to kind of just think about, these success stories where we have clients or we have proponents that are willing to include those things that are maybe above and beyond regulatory obligations, but that we feel are kind of required to be stewards of the land. So I just wanted to say, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I think Son with the Coastal Monitoring Program is doing a great job, and I would just encourage us all to share those types of success stories with those that we touch so that we can kind of encourage that kind of collaborative mindset moving forward.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for sharing that. And maybe the panelists will want to comment on that too. I'm going to I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to hand it back to you, Dan. I know you've been watching the questions in the Q&A. I'd encourage you to, I know some have been answered in text, but you may want to draw on those. And there's about 8 open questions. So I'll let you move into that with our panelists.
Yeah, I just want to maybe further answer, I believe her name was Sama, the first question.
Yes.
I think 2 of the greatest places where Indigenous peoples or communities could really help out is around threats and cumulative effects. Being on the landscape, they are able to be more nimble and seeing things as they change and identifying threats and changes over time that Western science doesn't necessarily have the ability to do. So I tend to agree with that comment that she had before. I'm not going to answer the other question because that's that continues to be a challenge to get people to, or industry to do the right things beyond what's regulatory required. There are some industries, in my opinion, that do better than others. The mining industry has really pushed, as far as some of the work that they do, are being proactive in some areas. But anyways, enough said there. So I will get into the additional questions that were in the, once I find them here, unless, does any one of the panels want to answer any of the, I think there's more of a question from the last question person. Sorry, I'm really bad at names. Does anybody want to say anything based on what he was saying about how do we get industry to do a better job of working with communities around monitoring and things that are important to the community outside of regulatory requirements?
I'll chime in there a little bit, and this maybe relates to one of the, I'm like trying to answer questions in the chat, but I'm too verbose and I can't do it in the word count because it's too complicated. But miigwech Rob for what you said, and being from Port Elgin or Caledon, you would be familiar with this area too. I agree, and Son has been able to actually, I don't want to say push, but has been able to move some of those bounds in terms of what's required by the regulatory regime and then what Son is looking for outside of that. And I mean, I don't know if the approach Son has taken, and this, I don't know if will work on your end because you're working from the opposite end, trying to get your clients or proponents to approach the situation like that. But for Son, it has never happened like that. It has never been the proponent or whoever approaching with that. It's been that SON has had to decide this is what we want to do, or these are our standards, or this is our approach, and just keep saying that over and over again, like not let go of it, or not say, well, I guess we'll just do the regulatory thing, or I guess we just have had to keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And I will say the progress we made with Bruce Power, I mean, that was a result of 15 years of pushing that, and like not the exact program, but pushing to do something beyond like what is required by the regulation. But I think one way for proponents to look at it in the bigger scheme of things is that it's better for the longevity of their project or whatever it is they're doing to have a positive relationship with, you know, the First Nation or the Indigenous community that whose territory they're in. Like, I think for me, that's what I tell proponents. Like, it's going to be better for you in the long run if instead of coming over here at the last minute and saying, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we're required to do, come in early, have conversations, start to like build a relationship, you know, or at least build a dialogue so you can start to see where each other are coming from. And instead make it like, it's important to have a positive relationship with this Indigenous nation, whomever it is, for the long-term success of this project, and be open to the relationship with that Indigenous community sort of changing what you thought your project was going to be. Do you know what I mean? Like changing small aspects. And I know Son has been involved in many projects from the beginning and has changed parts of it and then said, okay, like we've changed those small things. Now they're up to what we think is, you know, appropriate. And now we can like, you know, now you'll do this development and we'll feel comfortable that, you know, these concerns were addressed. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it is harder to motivate proponents because the regulators don't require them to do, you know, I don't want to say too much bad about regulators, but because there isn't sort of these extra requirements, or the regulations don't reflect the values and standards of Indigenous communities, right? They just don't. So I think we've just had to be pretty vigilant at that. But then I also have seen more and more proponents coming in and with that mindset, a few saying like, we'd like to build a dialogue. We'd like to kind of know what you're about. What do you think about this project? How can we make you part of it? But that's rare, but I think that's the approach.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. And I threw a couple thoughts in the chat as well. So let's try to, I see we only have 15 minutes left. So I think Michelle's question around how insights into how to negotiate for support and develop capacity, you partly touched on that as far as moving beyond just what's regulatory, required. How can any of you talk a little bit about how did you build the capacity? Like, was it through grants, or was it through industry support, or was it done, pro bono by everybody involved? Like, how do you build that engagement and capacity to actually do this type of stuff? Okay.
I can talk a bit with Kathleen. If you want a non-Indigenous perspective, I think when I started the lab, I just decided and negotiated with my institution things like overheads, so that and protected that. So it's my largest, longer running grants. The overheads are directed towards ODEMI. So for the life of every project, there is, that component of it. So there's like operational stuff. So I think the question is like for individuals, and the question of how can people in institutions, companies, or whatever, really thinking about the systems that you're in and how can you bend rules without breaking them. We've learned a lot and it's not easy, but I think that's, it's just getting people on the journey to think that there are different ways to achieve an outcome, and trying to create spaces in our teams led and guided by the Indigenous knowledge holders and community members, at the same time us going out of the institution and learning. So there's been a commitment on our part within the institution that we are in that is moving slowly, but as a group with the privileges we have to try and bend the rules, and everybody is sort of called to action that we all can do something and figuring out how to do them. So that's kind of our responsibility, and not the responsibility of the Indigenous community to answer us. You know, it really is just showing up and really asking them what skills do they need and what skills can we offer. And if that's not us, can we find the knowledge holder or the scientist that the community is wanting, or to answer the questions that you're wanting. So that's maybe one side of the other equation.
Catherine, yeah, and in your presentation, you talked about the 10 calls to action for around reconciliation and natural science people. So if you haven't looked at that, that's really good, because it contains some of these principles that we're talking about today. It was in our slide, so again, when you rewatch it, you'll see it. I don't have the title in my head, unfortunately, but
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that before we get to some more questions here?
I was just going to say that, I mean, for San, as you know, the way that, and I know many First Nations anyway are set up this way. I mean, unfortunately, and I started writing back to you, Michelle, in the chat, but my answer was too long, because I was going to say there's no simple answer, and it kind of depends on your First Nation. It depends on your leadership and sort of if they're willing to commit to these types of initiatives, because you really need leadership support and dedication like behind you. But unfortunately for San, and I don't know if it's the same for Jennifer, but the way that we've been able to leverage or negotiate to support these types of programs is unfortunately related to large companies, and there's more. Like we have the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, TC Energy, all sorts of big projects being planned for the territory. And we're only able to leverage those funds really because we have those big impactful developments, or as a result of something happening related to a government agency. Like there is, if you're in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, you know, there's a major decline in lake whitefish populations, which are the most commercially important species. So because of that, San has actually been able to leverage other government dollars to do research. So the capacity part was always also a really big challenge for us. How do we get community members? So even when we got the money, how do we get community members to do this work? And I just want to say, like, this was so important for this program. When the first year when we posted for these jobs, we had, you didn't need to have nothing, there was no educational barriers. There was nothing like that. We said, you need to be physically able to be outside all day, and you need to be able to show up to an interview and just tell us why you're passionate. Tell us why you're going to show up every day. Tell us like what you want to learn about your territory. And we were fortunate that one of the people who applied did have a fish and wildlife background. So she was really able to lead that team. But really, we had more people apply for those jobs than have ever applied for any positions that the nation has posted. And we had women and men of all different ages. So that showed us like, wow, people like, this is something people want to do, something people are interested in. And to build capacity, then we just trained. And again, though that took money, we just trained everybody right from scratch. And that's what we're going to keep doing. We're going to keep, when we hire, it's just whoever can just say, I'm passionate, I want to learn. We'll say, we'll train you, we'll do whatever we need to do. And it's really the dedication of these two, the CWMP team, which is two women at this point, and it's their dedication that have kept it going, and they'll now be training the next round of people, etc. So, I mean, I think there's also provincial and federal funding opportunities, but again, I think that's my experience. I don't know about others, but that's one of the main ways, is by having a big development in your backyard.
Yeah, same thing. Absolutely. The larger mining companies, Manitoba Hydro, they seem to have a little bit more ability to encourage and get onto better relationships and build capacity and things like that. I'm just looking at all the questions here. My apologies if I cut off any of the panelists. I'm going to go to the last question in the slide. It says, Indigenous knowing systems is based on relationships. It includes spiritual connection to our environment around us and teaches us a sense of inherent responsibility to all our relations. I totally agree. I just wanted maybe to highlight this because for those Western scientists that are out there, a really safe space to engage with Indigenous peoples is around relationships, and not just ecological relationships, but all our relationships. Like, you know, Indigenous people, and a lot of Indigenous people believe that, you know, there are spirits not just in people, but in animals, and, you know, in inert things like rocks and water and things like that as well. And it's, if you Google it, it's called the Taskrak ecosystem model, Mother Earth ecosystem model. It was done for the review of the Kiosk project, the hydro project, and I helped with that early on for them to get down their thoughts on how they saw the world. And it was, they knew that it would never stand up as far as the official environmental review process, but it was a way to demonstrate to Canada that this is how they were seeing things, and this is how they would determine whether or not they would allow a hydro dam to be placed in their traditional area. Anyway, so relationships are key, and having a proper relationships and a balance is really key. And I think that's a really good safe space for everybody to talk about, is the interrelatedness of everything. So there's other questions here, unless someone wants to say something about that. We've kind of, I don't know which other ones here to go. We only have 8 minutes left. Kathleen, how are the cottages and towns helping with this restoration? That's really important. So not just the large industry, but the local communities, you know, the communities of interest. Are they?
I was just typing back to that answer. So when I think about, like, I'll put Bruce Power aside just for a second, and I'll think about the larger thing I talked about with all these intensive developments going on around the territory. And I'll give an example. In the last 2 years, we got like over 100 permits for in-water works, meaning walls, to be built on the shore of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And as an aquatic ecologist, and my specialty being larval fish, that's very concerning to me, because those walls and things like that change water circulation pattern. These are really like kind of complex things to even think about, let alone understand. But anyway, so that's what I'm going to think about in this context. So there are a couple of sort of local environmental groups, like sort of like the Friends of groups, like Friends of Oliphant. There is the Bruce Peninsula Biosphere Association. So there's a few kind of localized groups that include cottagers and homeowners. And I'd say they're pretty proactive, and they look for ways to like volunteer or to collaborate on like Phragmites removal and things like that. I would say actually one of the biggest problems we're having, especially we're really trying to tackle this shoreline hardening issue, and really try to pump the brakes on and say, we can't promote systematic hardening of this territory. And here's some other options. And Dan, before this call, you were talking about riprap and vegetated shorelines and things. So really trying to push that. But actually, we're finding that a lot of people who live along the shoreline don't want to hear from us about not hardening their shoreline, because they're really worried about their property value. They're worried about their cottage, etc. And they kind of want to do like, what's the fastest option? I could just put this wall up. And they don't really want to participate. The ministry doesn't want to participate really in that conversation either. And what I think our biggest concern is we see like local municipalities, like provincial planning isn't really considering sort of long-term changes to the lake and high development on the shorelines and the impacts of hardening and things like that. So I'd say that individual or small groups of cottagers or homeowners are doing small things on their own. And we have talked to them about shoreline hardening and they agree. But actually the towns or the municipalities and the counties, they'll take our comments, but they're not willing to implement something sort of at their end. And again, capacity, we can only catch as many of these things and get as involved as in them as the limited capacity of, you know, Son's office will let them do. So I think, you know, the ministry have told us, you guys need to do more, like talk to landowners more and do this and this. And some of it is, why does it have to be our responsibility responsibility all the time. Like, this is a common problem. This isn't just someone's problem, but I'd say more so actually individual green things, cottagers, towns in terms of the actual municipalities and stuff. I'd say they're not really ready to engage, and they actually are doing this. They're sympathetic to landowners whose, you know, properties have been impacted by erosion or high water levels. They're sympathetic to people who have bought shoreline lots and not built on them yet, and so they're allowing them to build within 5 meters of the edge of the shoreline. So they, and all these things. So I'd say there's small groups of people who are doing awesome work and really helping, and then there are this sort of organizational level to implement those are not really doing much to help. So more is needed.
Perfect. There's from anonymous attendee, how would you go about engaging Indigenous communities and incorporating traditional knowledge and restoration projects, especially around the GTA, since you have a little bit of experience there? Or maybe it would be, yeah, it's either you or Catherine, I guess.
What do you think, Catherine?
I don't know. I think I go back to, I guess it depends, not knowing the person asking and their situation or the project. I think the idea of like focusing on relationships and restoration as the focus, and it might be individual, but you know, I think people have to value that the relationship is being the outcome, is being worthy. Like, I know we have deliverables and other things that we need, but investing in that authentic, you know, it's really hard to answer because everything is so context specific, but I always come back to like relationship building as the outcome. And then, you know, what comes from that is actually far greater, richer, and more meaningful than a grant deliverable. So most of our grant deliverables might say like, remove this habitat or whatever. But I think what's been more meaningful is like the journey that we've gone on to achieve that, or the story that took place, and like the community partnerships that came to achieve that. So I don't know, maybe other people have other thoughts, but I'd focus on that. And it is hard in a larger space, but there are pockets. I mean, we've been able, again, our group has only been here for 3 years, 2 under a pandemic, and we've managed to connect with people in a kinship way. So
I'll just chime in there too. Because someone said it's not limited to the GTA. So so for us, for engaging I guess our Indigenous communities and our members and incorporating traditional knowledge, we have to tie it back to something that is of importance to them. So for restoring a specific area or project, we try to link it back to like maybe important species that is culturally relevant, or plants, or something that they believe that I guess aligns with their values and beliefs. And then once you get that connection, then they're able or more willing, I guess, to participate and share information and I guess champion projects or stuff like that. So tying it back to something that they believe in and that is culturally relevant to them, I think is really helpful also.
That's actually a really good point. I totally agree. And yeah, my apologies, because the question isn't just for the GTA, it's anywhere in Canada. And anyways, yeah, no, that's thank you for that. I'm wondering, so it's 1 minute to, and I have to literally fly at 3 o'clock, but it doesn't mean that David, you're there. Are you able to take back over and decide whether or not we're going to take any more questions, or if we got a hard stop at 3 o'clock?
Yeah, well,
David,
I am here, and I will just I think we will more or less close it down here, Dan, and I know you need to move on to another meeting. So I wanted to first thank you very much for hosting and for your comments and insights. Greatly appreciated, and all the best. I hope we connect again in the future. I'm sure we will. And I wanted to take, I guess I would allow a bit of time right now. We're about to end, but if any of the 3 speakers had something else they felt they didn't get to add in, or
Right
comment
before
on
we
some-
go, I want to say
Yep.
how much fun this was. And I want to say what rock star panelists that we had today. This
Yeah.
was really good. Thank you very much,
Yeah.
everybody. It's been a real
Yeah.
pleasure. And I hope to see everybody in the future. Who knows how we or paths may interconnect with me and my workspace and you and the work that you guys are all doing. So thank you very much. And I will sign off now.
Good,
Great.
Dan.
And any of the speakers, was there anything you wanted to, that you feel like was left hanging or you wanted to comment on before we close it down?
Just stay in touch. I love your work, and it's just been so nice to be on this panel with you both.
I was going to
Okay,
say
we
the
have a,
same, not to alienate the audience.
Everyone.
we have a number of requests for there's a few different requests for getting in touch or sharing, so that I might follow up with some of the speakers on some of the requests to share. This whole thing has been recorded, so all these wonderful thoughts and these three great presentations are going to be posted up onto the aquatichabitat.ca website, and that will also put that presentation into YouTube. I will apologize. There were some people that had asked in advance. I'm sorry I didn't see that, but we did not set up the capacity for closed captioning, which did exclude those who did not speak English particularly well, or it's not a first language, or those who are deaf or otherwise cannot listen in on it, but could just see the slides. So I'm sorry about that, but it wasn't something we were able to put together. But YouTube, once it's up, will
Yeah, I was gonna say,
automatically
yeah.
close caption. So I want to just, again, thank our speakers. Thanks for your time today. There's a great audience. We will email out to all of them when the presentation is up on the internet. And thanks all for your questions. And we hope to do another webinar again in the future. And everyone have a wonderful day. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.